Yeah, well, behooves me to talk about transgender issue, especially the exciting upcoming new legislation in the Victorian Parliament, which isn't the first one in the world. I mean, there's similar things in British Columbia, I believe, amongst other places. We're now passing legislation to make it illegal for anyone to engage in what's loosely called conversion therapy of homosexuals or transgender people. Yeah, I mean, there was some legislation. This is all coming down from originally the state of California legislature, which concocted this monstrosity. But it's really quite obviously that the government's hand in hand with organised crime. I mean, we're given this terrible story about the apocalypse of transvestites, and transvestite activists, especially. I mean, they're all over, but they say things like that there's a real crisis in the transvestite community. Transvestites are getting beaten up, murdered, robbed, and they're driven to suicide. But I mean, I don't know what they're saying. It seems to me the implication is that the transvestites are dying in vast numbers, and it's up to us to make up the numbers again, and they're going to grab our children and forcibly take them away from us, and they try to castrate them and make them into these Franken women, and then they're just to make up the numbers, so the transvestites, that are left don't feel alone or something. Now, I think there's a great deal of dishonesty in these so-called statistics that are bandied about, and because the gay lobby, the trans lobby, those sorts of lobbies are famous for engaging in statistical skullduggery and trying to wildly exaggerate their importance, how many of them there really are, and how bad the situation is, and how many of them are getting beaten up by white supremacists. And I mean, they're old hands at exaggerating their numbers, and the amount of people who actually support them. For example, the gay marriage thing. I mean, it was a survey conducted by a statistical body, and it wasn't conducted by as a plebiscite or something by the Electoral Commission with all the safeguards. It was just a survey. Now, anyway, where to start? I mean, this idea that transvestites are getting murdered, it's quite possible that some of them are getting killed, but why don't they mention the facts that many transvestites are in prostitution of some kind or other, whether it's actually selling sex, money, or working in pornographic movies, or in some kind of grimy show. Transvestites generally work in prostitution or the sex industry, and they're very often inhabiting dingy red light districts and sleazy parts of town and rough violent parts of town. And like all prostitutes, transvestites are often getting bashed and robbed, and are often murdered, like all prostitutes, because that's what happens to prostitutes. You see these vulnerable young women out on the highway, scantily dressed, offering themselves to all comers. I mean, what do they think? What do they think is going to happen? I mean, now, trying to pack out the statistics and say, well, transvestites are getting murdered, as though there's this sort of, yeah, there's a bunch of guys, of white supremacists, in a van with, like Nazi mobile on the side, and they're going out deliberately at night to spot transvestites and bash them up because they just happen to dislike transvestites. I mean, that's this weird parody. There's no one in the world like that. But statistically, it's a form of statistical, well, double think, where you sort of transvestites who happen to be murdered because they're prostitutes, and they're mixed up in gang activity, and they get murdered because all the reasons that those people get murdered, and calling these things, a murder of a transvestite simply because of their that's a stretch. And furthermore, this idea that transvestites are always committing suicide, which is quite possible. I mean, transvestites are mentally disturbed people who became transvestites because they were mentally disturbed, and such people do often commit suicide. Now, furthermore, people who get mixed up into sort of a prostitute sex industry lifestyle are often addicted to drugs because they invariably get venereal diseases, horrible, disfiguring, painful, disgusting venereal diseases that are very hard to cure, and often like antibiotic resistant because they're so common, and people since the 60s have been just abusing antibiotics and thinking that antibiotics gave them a magical shield against venereal diseases. So well, prostitutes and porn stars and people in shows, they all very often have more than one painful, disgusting venereal disease, and they very often take opiates and whatnot, alcohol and opiates and hashish and things for the pain. Now, you very often you find transvestites getting addicted to drugs, and especially degenerating into heroin addiction. And now with the heroin market being flooded with fentanyl, and the numbers of deaths by overdose in the US, for example, skyrocketing to like 60,000. That was a few years ago, 60,000 deaths a year, and they were exponentially rising then. I mean, even if you had a a, um, a transvestite with a respectable job, like penthouse playmate these days, or a fashion model, yeah, it's the party lifestyle of those industries, fashion and whatnot, and they get into a lot of drugs anyway, and so one way or another, these people end up drug dependent, and nowadays that means exposure to fentanyl, which is very often fatal, and so it's actually disingenuous, dishonest for trans activists to just count overdoses as suicides. I mean, it's easy to do, and you don't know the difference. I mean, they may well have intended to kill themselves, or they may well have just just overdosed without knowing it. But nobody knows. I mean, they don't leave a note. So trying to count overdoses as suicides is again part of this dishonesty of the trans lobby. Now, I mean, fentanyl is flooding into the it's flooded into the legal drugs market, and it's flooding into the illegal drugs market because people buy it in packages from China on eBay, and it's very dangerous. I mean, the police who handle it have to wear masks because just inhaling the stuff can kill them. I mean, the stuff, it's an elephant tranquilizer, and they use it to tranquilize elephants and rhinoceroses and walruses when they're trying to cut debris off them. Now, no matter how tolerant one is to opiates, I mean, there's only so much the human body can take. And so many people are dying inadvertently from fentanyl overdoses because there's no regulation, and there's so much fakery, and legitimate looking pills containing uncontrolled amounts of fentanyl that are just deliberately put into cut street drugs to just boost up the opiate level and boost up the potency. I mean, there's no peace for the wicked, but yeah, I mean, I don't. You're in this world where if all these transvestites, these prostitutes, these heroin addicted prostitutes are dying, then organised crime is having quite a dramatic revenue loss, and it stands to reason that they just want to replace the transvestites they've lost with new ones. And I mean, should the government be playing along with this insincerity?